On today's Offie, we're going to be talking about a very interesting issue that's going on in British Columbia, and that is the BC government's and BC Hydro's attitude and relationship with independent power producers. And those are the folks who are building wind and solar farms and small hydro, run-of-the-river hydro projects. They've been around for 20, 30 years. And it looks like they're kind of maybe being squeezed out of the market by the government in hydro. To discuss that, we've got Lorene White, who is the Executive Director of Clean Energy BC. So welcome to the Zoffie, Lorene.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Now, Lorene, I'm going to start with full disclosure. We are helping your organization with some video production. We're going to do 7 or 8 videos for you. And then we've also done a little bit of work on helping you position, reframe narratives. And so whenever we report on a story that a client's involved in, we disclose it. We try to be as transparent as possible. So I'll put that out there and folks can make of that what they will. But let's start off by talking about who your members are. Who are the independent power producers of BC?
The independent power producers are companies that build power projects. So in British Columbia, up until this point, it's been primarily hydro because we're so rich in hydro resources, but also other forms of electricity production. Some of the other big areas of focus, of course, are wind and solar. But there are others as well. So these projects provide power to either BC Hydro. Some provide power to their own facilities or their own communities. And some of those sell excess electricity back to the grid, to BC Hydro. So there's quite a variation. PPs are sort of divided by BC Hydro into different categories. So it does include some of the large industrial companies like Alcan, whose primary business is not producing electricity, but rather it's a byproduct. Because it's so large, they're able to sell significant quantities to BC Hydro in addition to their own needs.
Sure. Well, let's a little bit of history. As I understand it, Lorene, some of these IPPs, small hydro, date back to the 1980s, but the big expansion, if I've got this right, came after 2007 when the then BC Liberal government of Christy
Campbell,
and then later Christy Clark, they expanded it and issued a number of energy purchase agreements. And some of these agreements were around, if I remember correctly, the $95 a megawatt hour up to $110 a megawatt hour. Have I got that right?
That's right.
Right, and so that is higher than what BC Hydro can generate power for. I think they're in the 30 to 40 range, or depending on, the legacy hydro assets give BC very, very cheap, clean electricity. So this, the IPP power was meant to supplement that at a time when when hydro was forecasting a fair amount of load growth, actually. And then, of course, the financial collapse and the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, those forecasts or demand collapsed and never got back to where it was before until 2017. So have I got that right?
That's right. And the situation at the time, when the government decided to pursue these types of contracts, is that BC Hydro at that point was importing about 18% of its energy. And the prices were getting quite high, so up to $250 a megawatt hour. So BC Hydro had signaled that they felt that this was risky. And the government of the day decided to implement what they call self-sufficiency, which really is when water reaches a certain level that BC Hydro can import, but it has to sort of meet their conditions around it. Otherwise, the the planned electricity would be provided by sources within British Columbia rather than importing.
Right, and I think you have about 130 members altogether.
That's right.
Right. So
Yeah.
here's the issue, folks. The BC NDP came into power in 2017. They're a minority government supported by the Green Party and I guess now independent MLA Andrew Weaver. And the BC NDP have been critics for IPPs for a long time. They saw them as sweetheart deals with the Liberals, high cost power that BC didn't need. They prefer everything to go through the Crown Corporation with BC Hydro. And they introduced last month, Bill 17, which ends self-sufficiency. They've already suspended the standing offer program for IPPs. And the minister, Bruce Ralston, is on the record, he's been quoted in the media a number of times, saying that this is high cost power and BC doesn't need it anymore. And they plan, the government, Hydro and the government plan to instead import cheap solar power from California because California has overbuilt its solar sector, and they can, on the open market, which is called Mid-C, they can import power for $20 to $30 a megawatt hour instead of paying one of these IPPs $100 a megawatt hour. But there are problems with that, with the legislation, which was withdrawn yesterday. So that's another story. But what's the basic fundamental flaw in that strategy, Lorene?
Well, the power that is coming from the spot market is excess energy from other jurisdictions. So it's never going to be a firm or predictable supply. And we've seen this happen before. In addition to that, the US transmission system has some pretty serious constraints. So there are some risks, and the notion that a utility would rely on that for energy is quite risky. So that's part of the issue. But the cost also, this is excess electricity. Of course, it doesn't reflect the true cost of generating that electricity. So it's on the market because it's excess, and so it's priced way lower. So that's not predictable, and the whole reason for implementing self-sufficiency in the first place was to have a predictable supply and a predictable price. So we're sort of looking at this government going full circle back to a risky situation. If there are, further drought conditions in the US that, we've had the California wildfires and other issues that interrupt electricity supply, I don't think that they would look to meet our needs. And certainly the fact that the power would be accessed on the spot market, that's never guaranteed. So I think that there's risk there. And it also doesn't account for the fact that the price of the technologies now, especially wind and solar, have dropped dramatically. So by around 2/3. So I question why the BC government would want to import rather than building something here in BC. And I don't see that would happen with any industry. We're always arguing for, building the BC economy and providing things here at home rather than importing. So this is sort of the same situation.
I want to point out an irony here, and that is that the government and BC Hydro are criticizing the IPPs for being high-cost subsidized power. But in fact, what they're doing, if the power they're buying from California on the Mid-C market is actually low, as low as it is, because it's subsidized by a 30% federal tax credit down in the States. And the reason that the California solar farms continue to put power into the market even when there's no demand for it, is so that they can earn that 30% credit. And so the government would be in an awkward position of ending businesses and jobs and investment in BC because it's subsidized and high cost, or subsidized, in order to buy subsidized power down in the US. And I'm not sure that that's going to go over well with BC voters. So, folks, I have to say, this is the most complex story I have ever covered as a journalist. And we're preparing an in-depth, a deep dive, basically, that will be coming out probably in the next week or two. But this is an onion that has so many layers, and I'm sure that I haven't peeled back all of them yet, and I peeled back a lot of them. So you'll have to bear with us a little bit as we try to, we peel the onion and then try to, connect the dots to make this all a coherent narrative. And I appreciate the fact if you find that a little challenging, because I certainly have over the last month that I've been working on this story. Lorraine, what's the Clean BC, which is the government's climate plan, it plays a big role in this story because independent calculations have been done, and they jibe with the government's math, that if the Clean BC is implemented and the targets are reached in 2030, the province will be short 26,000 plus megawatt hours a year of power, which is the equivalent of 5 Site C dams. That's a lot of power. And hydro isn't going to build any more dams and can't build that kind of capacity. And it's unlikely that the BC will be able to consistently and reliably import that from California. And really, the only option is independent wind and solar for sure. And that, I think that's your position, is it not?
Sorry, and we have garbage trucks here. So this is the thing that we find curious, is that BC Hydro is stating now that they have a surplus, that they will have a surplus for, the next 20 years. And yet in their integrated resource planning, they have not accounted for the Clean BC targets, except for electric vehicles, which were legislated. So we're finding that challenging, that they have not accounted for this in their forecasting. The integrated resource plan is due in February. And so we're trying to understand how you can plan for your supply needs when you actually haven't built in the demand that you're estimating from Clean BC. And yeah, Clean BC has very significant targets for electrification of the BC economy. And we haven't really seen the movement towards implementation yet, at least when it comes down to the brass tacks of doing forecasting for BC Hydro.
Right. I want to explain it this way, folks. If there are 2 basic utility models in Canada, Alberta and Ontario are one. They're kind of a market based system. And then you have the big crown corporations like BC, Manitoba, and Quebec. So if this problem were faced in Alberta and Ontario, the independent system operators in those provinces would simply issue a competitive call for bids and take the lowest cost one, which in Alberta, it was last year, was $37 a megawatt hour. It's very, very low for a wind project, and costs, of course, are going down. Then the private investors, whether they're utilities or others, would build the wind or solar farm, and then the independent system operator would tie it into the grid. Easy peasy, very simple. In Manitoba and Quebec, if those governments came forward with like a Manitoba Clean, Clean Manitoba or Clean Quebec, those 2 utilities would simply build more dams because they have huge hydrological resources. I was a hydro kid growing up in Manitoba in the 70s. My dad was the maintenance supervisor for the Kettle Rapids Dam on the Nelson River, the first dam of 5 or 6 now. And they can still add more dams on the Nelson River because it's that big and has that much capacity. BC can't do any of those things. BC is not going to build another hydro dam according to BC Hydro, so that option's off the table. It doesn't have, BC Hydro is in control of the power grid and is notorious for being slow and difficult to deal with in terms of tying into the grid. It has no interest in building wind or solar resources. It has little interest in being operating like the independent system operators in Alberta and Ontario. And so it makes it more difficult to bring on a lot of wind and solar in the decade between now and 2030 as is required. So you can see as you peel away all these layers of the onion, how complex this story is. And there is a tremendous amount of risk to British Columbia that it won't meet Clean BC standards, that prices to ratepayers in BC may go up if they can't buy enough cheap power on mid-sea. There's all kinds of problems here, and more that we'll discuss in a bit. But if I kind of summarize the issue, Lorraine?
Yeah, and so this is the challenge with the introduction of Bill 17, and there are two primary issues. One is that it proposes to repeal the requirement for self-sufficiency, which frees BC Hydro to simply access the mid-sea market for its needs. And then a second issue, and Andrew Weaver proposed amendments in both of these. The second issue is that it actually would enable BC Hydro to import, brown power, because the decisions would be made by regulation rather than legislation. And so it provides quite a lot of room to import based on sort of whatever standard makes sense. So the definition of clean energy then becomes more subject to interpretation and frees them up to actually import more brown power at a time when other jurisdictions are increasing their standards. Some would argue in an effort to, partially to block imports. So it's ironic, and those are two of the main amendments that independent Andrew Weaver introduced yesterday, and I think that that's why they pulled second reading from the order paper yesterday.
Yeah, the issue of brown power, I mean, the BC government, Minister Ralston made a big deal out of Bill 17 requiring certificates for clean energy and so on, and I think that MLA Weaver has pointed out some of the loopholes in that legislation. And of course, there are 14 states and 2 provinces in those Western markets that BC Hydro could draw on. And Wyoming, for instance, has a ton of cheap power that comes from coal-fired plants. And I can't imagine that would go over well with BC voters. So anyway, there's yet one more layer of this onion that I want to peel for you folks, because I think it's germane. In the United States and in Europe, they had similar kinds of utilities for many, many decades. And they're all based on what was called the cost of service model, which means that it costs X amount of, 5 cents or 7 cents or whatever the number is to produce and distribute the electricity. Then the utility needs a rate of return. And so the regulator would figure out what that is, and that's the cost of service, and that's what the utility got to charge. And what that's developed over the years is these big old stodgy, conservative, boring kind of utilities that, in fact, one could argue BC Hydro is. And BC Hydro was still organized that way. But south of the border and across the pond, utilities are reinventing and re-engineering themselves. And instead of cost of service, they're becoming a platform. And so they provide basic access to the grid through that platform. They manage their legacy assets. And then they have all sorts of great technology and services and so on that gives customers, both residential and commercial, a whole new range of options in managing their energy consumption. And it's really a dynamic kind of model as opposed to the more static model represented by BC Hydro. And this is all driven by the emergence of low-cost wind and solar, because and climate policy as well, basically, just as it is in BC. BC Hydro has no plans to re-engineer its business model. It thinks that it can go on for decades exactly the way it has for the last 60 years. And there's been no public discussion in British Columbia about that issue. it's not on the public radar, and yet that's what Europe and the US economies are doing. And it seems to me that at least should be in British Columbia, should be on the table. Now, Lorena, I understand from your point of view, you don't want to get into criticizing BC Hydro, but have I kind of summed up some of the issues that around the utility model that affect your members?
Yeah, that's right. And it makes it challenging when you are somewhat integrated with other jurisdictions, and a number of the companies that have facilities here in BC have facilities elsewhere in the world, in France, and so they're looking at how other jurisdictions are working, and we still have this old model, and it makes it very challenging then for integration. It makes it very challenging for preparing your own business cases and organizing your operations in a way that functions well in many jurisdictions, but not particularly well in this one. So it is a different business model. BC Hydro also carries an awful lot of debt, and so any change in market structure would really force a reckoning there. And I think that there's there would be a price to be paid for that. So understandably there would be some reluctance to look at that, but I don't see how we can continue on with that old regulatory model. And this is the case in many sectors of the economy that used to be regulated and controlled, and now they're open and functioning quite well and creating a lot of opportunities. One of the areas of real opportunity that we've seen is for remote and small and Indigenous communities that are able to build these small power projects for their own needs, and help to pay for the cost of those by selling some of that power back to the grid. So we have a number of First Nation members who have IPPs and find tremendous value in generating revenue for their communities and getting off diesel, which, in addition to being bad for the environment, is actually dangerous to have in a community. And so not being able to participate in that part of the economy for, more remote and Indigenous communities is really hard for them. So we've heard a lot from our Indigenous members that they're quite upset about the direction that this government is taking.
Now, attendees, if you wouldn't mind, if you down at the bottom of your video window, you will see where it says participants. You can click on there, and if you want to ask a question, you can raise the little blue hand, which I'll see in the participants list. And after this question, we'll take some questions from you folks, and you can, I'll call on you to unmute your mic and ask a question. So Lorena, let's stay with the Indigenous communities' involvement here for a bit. There is a tremendous opportunity for economic reconciliation. J.P. Gladue of the Canadian Aboriginal Business Council introduced me to this idea last year. And that reconciliation isn't just political, social, and cultural, it's also economic. Indigenous communities, First Nations, need to be given the opportunity, they need to be partnered with. And this, wind and solar projects, small hydro projects, are perfect for that. They have so many benefits, and your members have already invested to I think, of pretty close to $10 billion, and have indicated that they are willing to invest many more billions of dollars to provide the power that BC needs. And so let's talk about the projects that they would invest in. What is the likely cost per megawatt hour that we're talking about?
Well, the challenge for us right now is that because there hasn't been a power call for so long, we haven't had that competitive bid process to identify what the cost would be. So you know, we have to sort of go to more more global kind of estimates of what they would be. We can't really compare to Alberta because the terrain is very different. And so it's, for any industry here in British Columbia, the terrain makes any kind of industrial project more costly to build.
Sure.
But, you know, the prices have come down dramatically. You know, I'm seeing in the wind area, certainly in, you know, the $30 to $40 range elsewhere. I don't think it would be that low here. But it gives you sort of an order of magnitude of, you know, what it was before and how much the prices have dropped. So for the local communities, the other aspect of this industry that's very attractive is that the barriers to entry are quite low for an industrial type project. So you wouldn't see a First Nation building a mine typically, because of the resources that it takes to build that. So these kinds of projects for Indigenous nations are ideal, and I think they present a true opportunity for economic reconciliation. In addition to their own IPPs, several have equity ownership positions in IPPs of other companies. And the spin-off value of that, I think a lot of people don't capture. It's business relationships, it's the sharing of expertise and knowledge. It just opens so many doors for communities that otherwise aren't sort of part of the mainstream economy, that it's not just about the economics of that particular project, it's all the other benefits that partnering in the industry provides to them.
Right. Before we take questions, I'm going to give you one more number, and that is the cost to produce power from the Site C dam when it is completed in 2024 or 2025. Now, the government has a much lower number, but C.D. Howe recently did a study, and it said, look, if we use industry standards to calculate what it will cost to produce a megawatt hour of electricity from Site C, that number is $125. So that gives you an idea of and that's not including, of course, you know, BC Hydro has fudgy math where they stretch out amortization and do all sorts of, you know, they sharpen their pencil. But really and honestly, according to one of the leading think tanks, it would be $125, which is the highest cost power that could possibly be used or generated. And on top of that, the government has committed to providing electricity to LNG plants and natural gas production up in the Northeast. And they gave them the E-Drive rate, which is $47. So they're going to produce power at $125 out of Site C and sell it to the LNG and natural gas companies for $47. This is the kind of math we're talking about. The things that don't make sense in this story, but somehow get justified. So let's, I'm going to call on Dave Patterson. Dave, if you can unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Hi, very interesting topic. There's a few things I'm wondering if they've taken into account in their like energy demand forecast. BC is going to be mandating net zero buildings. That's going to drive up, you know, electricity use. California just mandated, you know, zero emission EV and hydrogen. That's going to suck up, I think, some or all of their surplus. Hydrogen uses a lot of electricity. And also recently, our grid operator in Alberta, ASO, I think, derated the BC tie because they had some, you know, some issues when there was a load spike. It didn't handle it very well. So are they considering any of those issues?
Lorene, take it away.
Not that I've seen. So I've been involved in BC Hydro's integrated resource planning process, which basically plans out to uh, 2039, and those topics haven't come up. You know, we get these presentations from BC Hydro with all their calculations and these wide bands of uncertainty, and we don't hear from them how or whether they've factored those kinds of things into their thinking. They don't share that with us.
I want to point out, Dave, a couple of things. Now, last week I interviewed a representative from the California Air Resources Board, and the interview will be going up on our YouTube channel sometime this week, about their commercial EV program that they introduced. So what they're doing is all medium and heavy duty vehicles, which is mostly trucks, so long haul trucking, garbage trucks, delivery vans, all of that, from 2024 when the program starts to 2045 when they expect to have 100% electric commercial vehicles. And so that's in addition to the aggressive plan they have to electrify the light duty, so the passenger cars and trucks. And transportation usually accounts for about 25% of the energy use. So you can imagine that's a tremendous amount of electricity over the next 20 years that's going to be going to electrify transportation. And that alone calls into question relying on cheap California solar for BC Hydro. And as Lorene says, they haven't even addressed that particular issue in their calculations. And you'd think that that would be one of the things that would be top of the list. And I should also mention that in addition to California, many of the other states in that market, in the mid-sea market, are also electrifying their economies. So, Washington and Oregon and other states. So it's not just California. And there's going to be a tremendous increase in demand on the American West Coast. And at the very, very least, that introduces a significant amount of risk that should be acknowledged in the strategy and accommodated in some way. And Lorene, of course, would argue that the IPPs are the way to manage that risk. So Mario Canseco, my favorite pollster from Vancouver. Sir, if you would unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Thank you, Argyll. Lorene, this is great timing because we had Joe Biden's speech on clean energy yesterday, announcing a $3 trillion infusion into something that has been forgotten by the Trump government. How do you feel about this? Is this something that could lead to some much better things down the road if you have that type of acknowledgement of how this is required in the future in the United States, which is definitely not what we see right now in the White House?
Yes, I think that it will, provided that we do see Joe Biden win, it actually means very significant changes in the energy landscape for us. And I think for us, it would be prudent to be planning for that.
I want to jump in here because folks will remember that under the Obama administration, of which Joe Biden was the VP, there was a program called the Clean Power Plan, and the idea was over, I forget what it was, 20 years, they were going to add a carbon tax. I think it was carbon pricing and regulations, and the idea was to shut down all of the coal plants in the United States. And there were some lawsuits, and it got delayed in implementation. It wasn't implemented prior to the 2016 election, and then of course Donald Trump was elected, and his administration killed the Clean Power Plan. And I would bet you a donut that Joe Biden is looking at reviving the Clean Power Plan and accelerating the end of coal. And then that raises the question of what will happen to all the now surplus wind and solar that may be in the American West. And if Wyoming's coal plants are required to shut down in short order, that sort of thing, that could very quickly, well, I mean, at the very least, it should be added into the list of risk factors that need to be accommodated. So good question, Mario. Dr. Joe Vipin, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
I'm just going to follow up on that. And I haven't looked at this recently, but I know about 2 years ago, there was a lot of articles coming out that said that the coal plant closures were all occurring well in advance of what the Clean Power Plan was actually organized to do. So, and that was based purely on economics. A little bit of carbon pricing, because there is a smattering of that throughout the United States, but just straight that wind and solar is so goddamn cheap, it's hard for coal to compete with it. And so, and also natural gas, you know, with the incredibly low natural gas prices that the United States has seen over the last few years. So just a comment on what your last statement was. And I also wanted to just maybe kind of a quasi question. As wind and solar prices continue to plummet, I mean, there doesn't seem to be a bottom to this. Everybody's expecting it to, you know, the rates to drop, but technologically we're amazing and we continue as a species to create cheaper power from renewables. There's a real risk of BC having, you know, super expensive prices while the rest of the country and the continent does well.
Yeah, let me address the Clean Power Plan. That was a combination of things. Yes, it's the cheaper wind and solar, but really it was cheap gas. And if you look at the energy mix over that period of time, it's and by the way, also, I think it was the National Resources Defense Council, or maybe it was one of the other environmental groups, but they had a very aggressive campaign to sue coal companies, utilities that were using coal power, and that also contributed to an early shutting of a lot of these coal plants.
Yeah, it's your Beyond Coal campaign.
Yes, the Beyond Coal campaign. Thank you.
$2 million from Mike Bloomberg.
Right, but in addition to that, it was, instead of all of that coal power being replaced by wind and solar, a significant part of it was replaced by gas. Gas has half the GHG emissions of coal, but it's still fairly significant. If you're headed to a low carbon, net zero emission by 2050, eventually those gas plants are also going to have to be phased out as well. So, Lorraine, do you want to respond to the risk issue and what Joe said about, you know, BC potentially having higher rates than anybody else? And I don't think that would be well received by BC voters.
No, and certainly, you know, looking at industry, you know, we have industry groups that are concerned about their electricity rates. And, you know, BC is trying actively to electrify the LNG activity that's happening. It isn't actually happening the way that they, I think, planned or hoped. And if we can't move with the lower cost energy, then that's going to have a ripple effect on other industry in this province. You know, that are, you know, we rely on forestry and mining, and certainly power costs for them are a huge factor in their ability to compete internationally. So, you know, the longer view really has to take those things into account, not just in terms of, you know, the residential ratepayers, but also in looking at how those prices affect the whole of our economy going forward, and how that compares to the other jurisdictions. We can't be that far out of sync with the rest of the jurisdictions, you know, that we compete with for business.
I want to call on Gordon Howell if he is able to talk. Gordon is an electrical engineer who is literally the solar pioneer of Alberta. He brought his first house with solar panels into the grid in 1995. I interviewed him for my book, The New Alberta Advantage, and we did a Zoffie with him, one of our first Zoffies. And he told the story about how difficult it was to hook his little house into the grid back 25 years ago. And the utility that he had to deal with wanted to treat him as if he was a utility, and made him jump through all sorts of hoops and pay fees and on and on and on. And that's over the course of 25 years and the deregulation that happened in Alberta. And I should say this now, I lived in Alberta during that time, and I remember all the opposition to deregulation. My opinion now has changed. I think that now deregulation in Alberta has turned out to be a good thing because it provides the independent system operator and a market-based solution where wind and solar investors can put together projects and get them onto the grid in a very timely fashion. And I want to give you a number. In BC, if you are like an LNG plant or you're a compressor station, it can take 3 years just to get BC Hydro to hook you into the grid. Yeah. BC Hydro is a very monolithic, old-style utility where it does things at its pace, at its priorities, and you have no choice because they are the monopoly and they control it all. And that is the opposite direction that the rest of the world is going towards. And I'm hoping, Gordon, are you there, Gordon?
Oh, yes.
Gordon, give us a little bit. I'm very curious because you're an international expert on this, and I don't think that's appreciated how well respected you are on the international stage in the solar field. What's your take? And I know you came in late, so you wouldn't have heard everything that Lorene and I were talking about, but your take on how solar needs to develop and how it needs to, be tied into the grid and how and the policies that need. And I know I'm asking a big question. Can you do it in a minute, please?
Yeah, good question. I'm sorry for being late. I was actually doing some economic calculations for the Airport City solar project in Edmonton, trying to rebut some BS that somebody was posting on Facebook. So I forgot about this, but I'll listen to it later. I am very fascinated how Alberta's re-regulation of its electricity industry has spurred private investment in solar. It's just going nuts right now, and the Edmonton's Airport City solar project is just one of them. The Traverse 600 megawatt project is another huge one where people independent of governments, independent of utilities and everything, go and decide what they want to do, and then the utilities connect them up under the mandate of the Alberta Utilities Commission. If the AUC says, yep, it's good, then they go do it. It's not about, does Alberta need the electricity or not? It's about, are all the laws being followed? If they are, then you are required to connect it up. So I think that this is boding very good for Alberta right now in the solar field. I'm fascinated at the number of international companies that are coming to Alberta, seeing our amazing solar resource and our re-regulated independent market, and then deciding, wow, this is fantastic. I'm not sure that answers your question, so you may want to restate it.
No, you know what, Gordon? That actually does very well, and I really appreciate your insights. And I'll leave you with this thought. It appears to me, based on the interviews I've done and the studies I've read, that BC is in serious danger of being caught, of being slow at a time when electrical systems and the economies, everybody's electrifying their economy. We need nimble utilities. We need nimble regulators. We need to be able to do things in a timely fashion. We need to get invest. We have to compete for investment. We need to bring in the new technologies. And there's another thing we haven't talked about is how the new enabling technologies like artificial intelligence are completely rewriting the utility landscape. And in fact, are a key part of this move I mentioned earlier to platforms as opposed to utilities. So if either you, I mean, we've learned this in other industries, either you are at the forefront or you're near the front of this parade, or you're at the back. And if you're at the back, that comes with economic penalties, it comes with higher costs, it comes with lost opportunities, on and on and on. And that's kind of my take on where BC Hydro is. There's only a small window to fix this problem. And there's only a small window to have a public conversation about what needs to be done and the changes that need to take place. and nobody is bringing it to the fore. And energy media, this is why we're taking this on, is because we see this as in the public interest, and we are going to be doing a lot of reporting on this issue because we think it's critical to the success of the BC economy and meeting climate objectives over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So Laureen, thank you very much for this. I really appreciate your participation today. And thank you very much, folks. We'll be sticking around a little bit after we stop the recording if you want to chat informally with Laureen and I.